Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Really pleased to be welcoming you to another City Talk, this time about solitude in the city and how we build connections or need to build connections to be an antidote to some of that. We're really pleased to be partnering with the Goethe Institute again on this series of programs. The Goethe Institute's a cultural institute in Toronto, all around promoting and advocating for German culture and the experience of the kinds of rich experiences they've had. They have 3 films, I think, that are part of this series on loneliness, and I think it's called Complicity, C-I-T-Y, in boldface and in caps. And there are 3 films that are going to be available. We'll put that into the chat so you can watch some of them if you'd like to. They're very thoughtful, as you can imagine. They come from a rich cinematographic history there in Germany, and I watched one of them last night. A very poignant movie, and the others I expect will be equally so. So I hope that you can tune into those. It's important for us, I think, to be reminded that culture and art helps us understand what's really going on and gives us kind of eyes, different kinds of eyes to see. And we appreciate all the gifts that artists bring to us in different capacities. And so for us to have film and have Goethe working with us on this series has been tremendous. I happen to be in Toronto today. They just asked me to shut the patio door that I have, which was bringing a lot of bird sound and also construction noise into the broadcast. But Canada is a big country, and I know that construction is everywhere. But was the reality I have here in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of a number of First Nations, Inuit and Métis, particularly the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, home to many First Nations now, and 2 treaties here, the Williams Treaty and Treaty 13. We continue to have these conversations about the extent to which urbanism has been an exclusionary kind of reinforcement of how societies kind of sort people, and often by race and by different kinds of economic characteristics. And so the connections that we're trying to bridge here are across all sorts of different kinds of differences. And that's part of, I think, our conversation today is going to be to talk about how do we actually forge those relationships, and how can urban life actually enable people to have a deeper sense of connection. And I want to ask our gang about things like, is loneliness a problem, or is loneliness part of life? I don't know. I want us to talk about that as broadly as we can. A number of you will have seen in the media this morning that mental health providers across the country are suggesting it's code pink, that we have lots of young people that are struggling, particularly with the impact of COVID and the lockdowns and the legacy that may in fact leave for those younger folks. And so again, I want us to think a little bit about particular populations and how they experience loneliness. I've often remarked to anyone that was interested in hearing what I had to say, that if this had happened to me when I was a young person, and I had been trapped in my family of origin house, that would have been a very, very difficult time for me, because my life was lived outside in community, playing sports and engaged with my peers and kids on the neighborhood and my street, and to be constrained and not be able to enjoy that kind of connection. So here we've had this unbelievable moment. Now, what are we, 16 months? To have a really vivid view of the components of our communal life that have been working well, that we're deprived of, but also ones that weren't working very well, and that we now need to start to move in and try to correct, so that when we emerge, we'll emerge better and stronger. So joining me today, you'll see a couple of familiar faces. One is my colleague, Diane Dyson, who's stepping in, who's in Toronto today because we had someone fall ill, and so she has stepped into the breach and is going to talk about some of the work that she's done around particularly immigrant communities and connection. And then Patty and Lucinia and Chatty coming in from different parts of the country to reflect on this theme of solitude and, I think, connection, or loneliness and connection. So what I'm going to suggest is we'll go around and I'll ask everybody to just tell us where you're coming from. And then I guess some of the initial thinking that you've been doing, because this is part of your life's work, is to find new ways to make these kinds of connections. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your perspective, and it can be pre-COVID if you like. So don't feel you have to only talk about COVID, because a lot of what we're dealing with, of course, is pre-existing conditions that existed before COVID, but were made worse. So Patty, can I go to you first? Welcome to City Talk. Really great to have you join us. Tell us a little bit about where you are and what you do and what your perspective is on this topic, could you? Thanks for coming.
Hi, Mary. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Well, so today I'm joining from Vancouver. I'm originally from Mexico, and in the last 10 years, I've been going back and forth in between Mexico and Vancouver. So I consider both of them my homes. I can say that definitely the first time that I moved in Vancouver, everyone was telling me this is a lonely city. People don't talk much to each other. Neighbors are a little bit kind of like wrapped up in their own world. And I didn't have that experience at all. So when I was seeing all of these reports from the Vancouver Foundation about, it's called Connect and Engage, that loneliness was on a rise and that more people were report to feel lonely more often than they would want to, I was pretty surprised. So back then in 2015, when I started researching this topic, I wanted to know what was at the core of these things and why were people feeling like this? Because coming from a country where sociability is everywhere around me, and you actually have to put some control your social exposure sometimes so that you can have time for yourself. I was very curious about this. However, I'll tell you more about this. I'm just gonna leave a seed right now. I went through depression, deep anxiety and depression. So I know how what it is to be there. And my work today actually builds on this life experience. What I do at Happy City is try to understand what is the relationship between the built form, specifically multi-unit, the design of multi-unit housing, and social connectedness. So when I arrived to Vancouver in 2015 and started working at Happy City, this project was about like, hey, how can we build a way smarter in a way that we are actually building family homes that are not driving people apart but closer together. So I have been developing along with my team the Happy Homes Toolkit. That is basically a project, a 5-year program in which we have started identifying the design elements, but also programming and policy that can help bring people together, and how we can advise municipalities to push policy forward, but also how we can advise developers to enhance well-being while they're designing the space. So make wiser decisions in terms of how you're going to bring people together. That's basically what I do on a daily basis. I also have a background working with public space. That's how I got in love actually with the idea of connecting people. I thought that architecture was doomed. I had a rupture with architecture at some point. I thought that architecture was just producing luxurious buildings that were only focused on form and didn't have the possibility of actually bringing people together. So I went into public space and started addressing social connectedness through the design of urban parks. And for a while, I worked on that. Right now, I'm mostly on how housing can actually bring us together. And just to refer quickly to COVID, I don't think that loneliness is something that has emerged from COVID. It is a long-standing issue, a challenge that North American cities have, and a lot of cities around the world. There's definitely this consideration about weather, right? Like if weather brings us in and if we spend more times at our home, but then also our homes, the place that we used to spend 8 to 16 hours, and now we are spending up to 24 hours, they are not designed to promote social connectedness. They are not designed so that we can actually have a conversation with our neighbor without feeling overcrowded. So you would say, well, what about high rises and my building? I bumped to people in the corridor, in the elevator, in the mailbox. The thing is, when we are driven to these spaces that are really, really small, and you feel that you are like next to the other person, it actually wants yourself to pull away. So there's no consideration about the actual social safe space that you need so that you can engage in a proper conversation and have the ability to retreat when you want. Mm-hmm. So I just want to leave you with this thought. Think about the amount of times that you feel uncomfortable in an elevator. And if you haven't, I would be very curious, like what sparked the conversation, or how do you manage to get over like this kind of like weird moment when you feel trapped with so many people in an elevator. So I leave it there, Mary.
Patty, thanks. Boy, so many interesting things you raised there. I just want to pick up on several of them. I'm sure my other panelists will as well. I wonder too if we're going to have to do some clarifying of language. So loneliness is not necessarily the same as isolation. So maybe that's one clarification that I'm hearing you say. But also, you know, as you're pointing out, on which I'm going to go to you, Shadi, next to talk a little bit about your perspective. At Happy City, you guys are actually making the case that if you physically design cities differently, or communities and buildings differently, you can enable this kind of you know, sort of accidental encounters, which somehow maybe are an antidote to isolation. You know, they don't, you actually, yeah. I mean, we're very aware of this through some of our platforms at CUI. We put up citysharecanada.ca because we wanted to surface all the ways that people were reaching out to each other, different kinds of ways through COVID to improvise. And we were calling it the DIY city, you know, all of a sudden Facebook groups and, you know, all that stuff. And so the question is whether the spatial environment, which I think is the argument you're going to make, could have an impact on that. So, of course, the big dying question, I hope people are going to come in on the chat for us and give us some viewpoints. The big question is going to be then, you know, are people less lonely or less isolated? I'm not sure they're synonymous if they live in dense environments versus in suburbia, for instance, or if they're on a farm you know, and their closest neighbor is far away. So anyway, we'll come back and touch on a whole bunch of these things. Thanks for offering that, and also thanks for sharing some of your personal experience about how that informs your work in terms of your own mental health challenges, which I really empathize with and understand that that's part of how we see the world. It's reflected by our own experience. So you came from a very dense city, Mexico City, right? And I've heard this too about Vancouver. I want the Vancouverites to tell us whether or not they think they're really a lonely city. And, you know, I'm interested whether we can even actually say that, you know what I mean? Like a city is a this or a city is a that. Anyway, Shadi, let's go to you. You're in Mississauga. I'm going to be very interested to hear what you have to say about whether Mississauga is a lonely city or not. But talk to us about your sort of perspective on this and your engagement, and then we'll go to you, Lucinia, after, and then Diane, you're going to do cleanup. Go ahead, Shadi.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I'm so happy to be with you. My name is Shadi. Originally speaking, I'm from Syria in the Middle East. So now I'm happy that I have two homes, two countries, Syria and Canada. Damascus in Syria is the oldest inhabitant capital in the world. So it's a very, very social city where you can find all people are integrating with each other. So I'm used to that. And we all know that Canada welcomes newcomers and welcomes immigrants. So in a way or another, most of us were newcomers in this country at one point. When I came here to Canada, actually, because of the loneliness that one can find, I involved myself with the newcomers, and I took it as a responsibility for myself to help them overcome this issue, because actually being or feeling lonely is something different from being alone. You can be sitting with many people, with your family members, but at the same time you still feel lonely. So actually it's a big issue, and as I told you, I started working on that, especially to support the newcomers to overcome this challenge. Because even away from Canada, even back home or in any other country, if you change just your city, you'll feel as a stranger in the new city. So this is common. But what is not usual and what we must face and overcome is that feeling that comes from loneliness. So number one, we need to accept that feeling. We need to accept the feeling of loneliness, because acceptance is number one to face this thing. After that, we need actually to take action. We can't just play the role of the victim all the time, and I just complain that I'm feeling lonely, because this will increase, and by the end, it will actually escalate to other levels that we don't want to get to. So I have, instead of blaming others or blaming the circumstances or blaming any other body, I have to take action. Taking action actually involves many things, which we can talk about later on, because we all know that the issue of loneliness can affect our physical and mental well-being. And in a study that I read about, I found that the feeling of loneliness might increase the mortality of individuals by 26%. So it's dangerous, and it's there. And we cannot connect it just to Corona or COVID, because, okay, COVID is one issue that we are all facing now, but can we guarantee that in the future we will not face anything else? No one can guarantee anything. So we are open to anything. So it means that we have always to be ready to face and to cope with what we face and to interact and take action so that we can eliminate all these challenges. The big word for me to make all that done is integration. Yeah, I leave the space now for other colleagues, then we can elaborate more on this.
So interested, I'm a dual citizen between Canada and the US, and I always live with this, melting pot mosaic business. And when you say integration, I'm immediately thinking, okay, are we diminishing our own ethnic and cultural identity if we do integration? You're saying, no, we don't.
No. Yeah, because actually for me, I'm still that Syrian guy, but at the same time, I'm a Canadian guy. And I totally understand my rights, my responsibilities, what to do in Canada, where to go in Canada. I used to the Canadian lifestyle. I have many Canadian friends who have been here for ages and ages, and I like them, they like me, and I like the way they live, they like what I added to them. And actually, look, this is a mutual process. Whenever our newcomers, it's a mutual process. We have to accept them, and we have also to teach them our own lifestyle.
Both, yeah. Can I just encourage people? It's so nice to have people coming in on the chat, like Camilla Fisher. I see that you're there, and of course, one of our super city talkers, Abigail Slater, is back on. I see that, and we've got folks coming in from Madrid and from Kelowna and Edmonton and Aurelia, Calgary, DC. Glad to see DC, Sunny, Stratford, all those places. Thanks everybody for tuning in. When you provide a comment in the chat, can you adjust your settings to panelists and attendees? If you only do panelists, then only the 5 of us see it. So 6 of us see it. So if you could just, and then those of you that have posted, if you've already only posted to just attendees, you might go back in and repost everybody so people can see. Shadi, I was in Damascus.
Really?
Yeah, I will never forget my time in Damascus. It just is and I've been so saddened to watch so much of the built environment be destroyed by the war. And but as you suggest, I experienced what you're describing in terms of how that ancient city had been designed in such a way that you were having all sorts of kinds of day-to-day collisions with people as you found your way. And of course, the Islamic city form, urban form, is historically embedded in that sacred geometry of connection. So I feel for you in terms of the adjustment you've made to go to Mississauga, but we're going to talk more about Mississauga when we come back, and we'll talk about some of the other things that you just mentioned too. Okay, Lucinia, let's hear your experience from sunny Edmonton. I hope it's sunny in Edmonton today. And I want to hear all about your experience because I know you're a planner. You've obviously professionally been interested in this, but you've also got a personal interest in it. So welcome to City Talk, and really glad to have you on.
Hey, thank you, Mary, and good morning to everyone. And I'd like to greet everyone in my own language. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat, which is good morning in Tagalog. So I bring you greetings from the Multicultural Health Brokers Co-op in Edmonton, and it's not sunny. We had a heavy dose of snow last night.
Lucinia, you've got snow.
I worry about my tulips and my front yard plants. So anyways, let's set that aside. So just to give you a bit of a background, I serve on the board of the Multicultural Health Brokers Co-op, which is a workers co-op that provides education and family support services for over 4,000 individuals annually from 60 ethnocultural communities in the city. I think we are this one organization who have the widest reach to immigrant and refugee communities in the city. We have over 90 multicultural health brokers, bilingual and bicultural workers connecting individuals and families to relevant resources, support, and community. So Patty and Shadi had spoken, of course, definitely from their own experience as immigrants and as newcomers. So I'd really like to add to this experience of isolation and loneliness. And more so, I think within the context of the pandemic, I think as Patty had said, this is not an old issue, but the pandemic definitely has amplified these feelings of isolation and loneliness as we, self-quarantine in our own homes. So, from my view, I think that the loneliness and isolation can be viewed from three realities of the immigrant experience. From the newly arrived in Canada, the experience of inequities as we strive to have a better life and the desire for belonging in the new homeland. And we spoke, Patty and Shadi spoke about their experience in newcomers. So, you know, and we all experience being isolated and disconnected, especially when one arrives in Canada in the middle of winter, which I did many years ago. So
and you stayed, and you stayed.
Yeah,
you didn't go. You didn't turn and go right back.
No, from a plus 25 degree from the Philippines in 1994 to a minus 25 in Edmonton, and I did research this. The particular day that I arrived, temperature in the Philippines and in Edmonton, and so heavy snow, snow up to our knees. And, we didn't have that much orientation back home, about what winter would look like. And so having in our house, I don't know anyone, don't know how to go about the bus routes. It was a very, very lonely it was a very, very lonely place for me when the kids are out in school, my husband at work. So I'm alone. I've watched all the TV shows that I could watch. There was no internet. Phone calls are so expensive. So the feeling of isolation really, breeds into you. And there is something about the cold, dark, and snowy days that makes one long for old friends, familiar places and things to do in our home country. I would sit at the window and look, oh, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. What would I be doing if I were in the Philippines? And that went on for several months until, early spring when finally I was able to get out and find work. I think at the time, I was very distressed, right? And for many times in my mind, I really wanted to go back. But I think, again, every change of season is a change of attitude. So, that's when I was able to go out. So I leave that experience for now. So that was 25 years ago. And I'll talk about how that changed over the years. But I also want to talk about the other reality, which is our loneliness rooted in unfulfilled dreams and expectations. When we can't find jobs or build our careers from the education and work experience we bring to Canada, we are distressed and yearn for something meaningful in our lives. So that's why many of our university educated immigrants who come here, and this once again amplified during COVID. Many of us work in businesses mostly impacted by COVID. The food and service industries, where many of us were unemployed or unprotected in our workplaces, such as we have seen in the outbreaks in the meat packing plants. And finally, loneliness comes from the perception of not belonging and feeling excluded as a result of fear of being harassed and assaulted because of our identity. And once again, it's not a new issue, but COVID has exacerbated this. We all know about the surge of anti-Asian hate incidents and the spate of assaults on women wearing a hijab in Edmonton streets and bus terminals, all public spaces. So I'd like to end this particular part of it's really on a positive note. Many of the families that we work with have also told us that the time spent at home was an opportunity for parents and children to be together and build stronger family relationships, where before mom and dad used to be very busy with work. As we all know, many of our immigrant workers have 2 to 3 jobs to keep the family going. So I'd like to end on that positive note around strengthening family bonds. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucinia. Were you from Manila?
Well, the neighboring city, which is Quezon City. Yes.
How big a city? How many people live there?
Oh, I think right now the population is almost as close to Canada's population.
To the whole population of Canada, exactly.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and then you moved to Edmonton. It was interesting your comment about winter, and oh my God, that you had to absorb a 50-degree temperature change from one place to the other. But I remember being in Edmonton in the first weekend of December 1989. Because I remember it was because it was the weekend of the Montreal massacre, and I was working and I had meetings at Edmonton. I stayed with friends in their house, and what I remember the trauma of the coping with the Montreal massacre, as everyone was across the country. But also I remember how cold it was, and I remember thinking and observing that people in Edmonton don't go outside when it's that cold, and why those plus 15s are necessary, because it was just freezing. And COVID in many ways has been like a 24/7, 14-month winter where we just couldn't get outside, or if we could, we were constrained. So these are all these poignant images. But also it's interesting, all three of you are immigrants, bringing the newcomer experience and helping us, I think, draw this distinction between being alone, being lonely, but also being isolated. And then this notion of belonging. All three of you have talked about belonging as the differentiating factor that somehow, and then you've just extended it there, Lucinia, to talk about the ultimate expression of not belonging is when you experience some kind of racist epithet or attack or disparagement, or which the broader culture says to you, you don't belong, and we're going to so it's all very complicated. And so I'm going to go to Diane next, who's done research particularly on newcomers, to talk a little bit about this, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about what do you think the kinds of tangible ways are for people in our world of urban design, urban planning, urban animation, city building, to contribute in a different kind of way to foster this belonging and attachment. So Diane, can you just share a bit with folks your experience and your knowledge of this?
Sure. I too claim the status of being an immigrant to Toronto, as I came here as a young adult from the nation of Quebec, and went through those many months and early years of isolation, wandering the street and feeling those disconnected. But I've since gotten a mortgage and children, so I've settled in. Although I still have a longing, that double thought of, do you go home? The idea of loneliness is gripping, I think, across many of us. Poets have talked about, I wandered lonely as a cloud, until I saw a crowd of daffodils. Psychologists have measured out that whether it's loneliness is the same as isolation, whether it's the same as depression, and those are all actually separate categories. And policymakers more recently have also been looking at this as an issue. So we see both in Japan and the United Kingdom, they've set up a minister of loneliness to talk about those issues. So I think that's why, Patty, we saw that in Vancouver, that it became sort of a policy interest to look at. And we do measure those things through the some of the StatsCan surveys that go out that are tied to looking at how our health is tied to our sense of belonging, our sense of isolation from others. And I guess I just wanted to flag that there's when I'm thinking about this at a policy level, that there's a couple of kinds of connections that people need to have. They need to have a close bond connection, which is, do you have someone that you can call at 3 a.m. if you need them? And if you don't have that, then you'll talk to seniors who talk about, I worry that I'll fall down the stairs and nobody will know for days and weeks. It's a vital fear. And then there are those looser connections that any of us who come to a new place may or may not have, because we're not talking to our neighbors, to the people in the elevators. We're not hearing about where's the best pizza or what's the best school. Those kinds of loose connections are also really important. And so I think that theme of belonging really is an important one for policymakers to think through in built form, in looking at the institutions within neighborhoods. Do schools close at 3 o'clock, or are they places that other people can go in and utilize? Are there community hubs? I think is a provocative idea for us to be thinking through.
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of people here who are in the urban policy business. Can you actually create policies that actually enable connection? I think we all know you can create policies that disable connection. So the question is, can we come out of this differently and do it differently? For instance, this is an anecdote that's often talked about in terms of suburban life, where the roads are too wide. And you can't just wander along a road and then cross the street because there's a shop over there you want to. You have to actually go to a light, and you have to make, hope like hell that the light is long enough so you can get across it, because you might have to go across 2, 4, 6 lanes to get to it. So obviously we've got all sorts of ways that we've embedded this. Let's talk a little bit, if we can, about this notion of changes you could make to the built environment. That's what Happy City is talking about, Patty, right? Like that's part of what you guys, the toolkit, I'm assuming, is getting at. Someone has asked, Laurel Snyder has asked in the chat about this, about do we have data, for instance, to show that if you have easy access to public space, do we actually know that we have better mental health benefits? Does anybody have access to data like that? Is it a hard sell? Lucinia, have you had a hard time convincing people that we need to do this? Or do we have the data? And if we have the data, why aren't we doing it? Patty, do you want to take that first?
Sure. So I'll jump in answering this question, but also actually saying, Diane, thank you so much for bringing up this piece about how we need different relationships to feel ourselves like we're addressing our social well-being. In terms of ratio, I wouldn't say there's ratio, because also this would speak to, I think that we would need to compare or it would be a different response for the diversity of cities out there. Depending also on our cultural background, the ratio is going to be different. However, what we do know and what evidence is telling us is that people who are connected can live up to 15 years more. People who are socially connected can also overcome cancer more easily. They are less likely to have a heart attack. They are more likely to participate in community events and also be part of the community life and political life of a city. So data is telling us, or evidence is telling us, that actually it's a good thing to be connected. Why aren't we doing this more? You are touching, Mary, here in one of my favorite topics. One of the things that I've encountered here in Canada is that the policies are actually one of the big barriers. Several years ago, we conducted a study that is called Design to Engage. And we identified what were kind of like the big moves that could be implemented through the design of multi-unit housing to bring people closer together. And after identifying those 6 big moves, I started asking people, stakeholders, planners, architects, designers, developers, why aren't we doing this more? And 80% of them would answer, because it's a policy thing, because there's a barrier. Either you have to address the bonus density and then also the affordability ratio, but there's no chance for you to negotiate or to or planners don't have kind of like clarity in terms of saying, okay, if this person is bringing social well-being into the community and going beyond the minimum standards of the number of amenity rooms, or taking advantage of the setback, that maybe instead of like just having a setback, you have a garden, a community garden where people can be close together and having these casual encounters. So if you don't have, as a planner, also these tools that are leading or give you a hint of what's going to be for a benefit, not just for residents, for the community, then how do you negotiate that bonus density? How do you negotiate the FSR exemptions? So I know that I'm getting into the technical pieces here, but trying to get back to how design can actually be a tool for social connectedness. Well, I want to start from the premise that when people feel that they are part of something that is greater than themselves, that's when they feel connected. And along with this premise is this concept. I want to try to weave this with the concept of the different levels of social intimacy that we can have access to. So the sociologist Robin Dunbar plays with these numbers that talk about how we need intimate, close encounters, and then relationships with neighbors that are going to be kind of like our daily relationships. And we don't know a lot about people, but at least we know that someone's kid went to college or someone's grandmother is visiting. And then we've got the relationships at the community level. When we are familiar with the faces, we might not know the names, but we are familiar with the people around ourselves. So we need this spectrum of social connectedness to feel like we are actually doing well. And if the spaces around us don't provide those kind of spaces so that we can have those intimate encounters, but also meet with the community in large gatherings, then we are failing as designers. And here the one of the things that I think that we have put all of our eggs in public space as our only basket that can solve this. But my kind of like my call to action is saying multifamily housing and the way that we are building dense cities can also do this. And the more that we respond to this idea that we need denser environments so that we can address affordability issues, social connectedness and affordability are also deeply deeply connected. If we go back to the idea of equitable cities, if we don't understand that in order to make space for everyone, for different, for diversity, for different range of from low to high income within the neighborhood. Sorry about that. Those are my dogs.
It's okay. Life.
But then if we don't actually make this connection, then we are failing to understand what a complete neighborhood is. So I know that I'm being like kind of like playing with a lot of concepts here, but feeling the sense that people can feel that they are part of something greater than themselves. That's one. And yes, we can do it through housing. There are amazing examples out there, and actually one of them is in Toronto, 60 Richmond House. That it's a collective of people working around plants, gardens, gardening, chefs, and they build this building that is actually that focuses on gardening and providing the experience of food to others and everyone, and that's a value that connects people within that building. So there's opportunities like this about how do we create value within the places that we live in.
Yeah, so that we can we need both, right? We need both. I agree with you that there's kind of a how's that word? Fetishization. I didn't quite get it out, but you know what I mean. We've got a fetish thing going for public space. The public space will solve everything, but in fact, it has to be improved. Living circumstances improved, and we saw this during COVID, that the neighborhoods where the incidence of COVID, first of all, that there were higher incidence rates. I can see people nodding about this. We're in dense environments where there was overcrowding. So what Jay Pitter, many of you are familiar with Jay's work, and she's a fellow with us and continues to insist that we face this, that there are forgotten densities, there's bad density, and it's not just, throwing a park next door is not going to be the only answer. So it has to be both and. You mentioned Robin, who was the scholar you mentioned? An academic?
Robin Dunbar.
So maybe we can get that into the chat and get some of Robin Dunbar's work. I see that Abby's suggesting Putnam on Bowling Alone. Diane, you mentioned Eric Kleinenberg. His work in 1995 about the heat wave in Chicago wasn't just about income. It was also that those more affluent folks lived in parts of the Chicago neighborhoods that had better urban planning around them. So they had more social engagement, so more people were aware of everybody, so that when they suddenly needed to find people, they could find them because they had seen them, as opposed to the more isolating neighborhoods that were designed poorly. And Eric's gone on, he's been a guest on CityTalk, and he's gone on to talk about the vital role of places like libraries that allow us to connect with one another. If we come over to you now, Shadi, let's just talk a bit about, I'm hearing Patty saying we got to design better, we got to build better, but you've also been creating virtual kinds of networks through the Together initiative, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because it kind of is both and, isn't it? There's no sort of single solution here.
Yeah, I just want to comment at what Patty has just mentioned. She was talking about the resources, tools, and policies, which I totally agree with and I totally respect. But okay, let me talk from the opposite side, from infield side, from the practical life of people who are living in this city or in any other city. Yeah, because I'm in close touch with them, so I know what they are going through. First of all, let me just highlight the idiom of newcomer. You are a newcomer when you arrive to this country. And after some time, this must change. Unfortunately, I know people who are still newcomers, regardless of the state that they hold.
30 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. They are citizens. They have been here for so long, but they are still newcomers. So I used to call them old newcomers.
Or old comers.
Yeah, actually, no. Actually,
What bothers you about that, Shadi? Is it because you feel it's signaling that they still don't belong, even if they've been here 30 years?
yeah, actually, and we can't blame them actually because they were left alone. They were left behind. So okay, policies are there, tools are there, resources are there. Okay, but for me as a newcomer, for example, I'm very limited in using the language. Okay, who's going to take my hand and show me the resources and tell me about the tools? I need someone. Number one, in this country, we have to work on, especially with the newcomers, we have to change their mindset. Because, you know, there is a proverb in Arabic language, it says that change is the enemy of human beings. We don't like to change.
No.
We always like to be in our comfort zone.
Right.
Although it's not that, maybe I'm not feeling comfortable in my comfort zone, but I'm afraid of changing it. I don't want to change.
So
Okay.
Shadi, what do you do with multi-generational situations? So I hear you about this, that people remain newcomers, but I am, you know, I lived in New York City for a number of years, and I lived in Washington Heights, which is Latino, and so I would go into the restaurants there, and I would have people waiting on me that had been born in the United States, and maybe they were 20, 25 years old, and they did not speak any English. Yeah. And their families would have been immigrants into that environment. And we have it here in Canada too, where there are various kinds of businesses that are owned by newcomers or ethnically, culturally oriented businesses. And the elder generation does not actually speak English, and they rely on their kids to get them to register to vote or register their vehicles. Diane, I can see you wanting to chime in. What do you want to say about that? Go.
Well, you're talking about my in-laws who also didn't speak English and never went to a school interview or anything, but it really is that at a policy level, a discussion about the value of ethnic enclaves. And they actually serve a very valuable contribution in that you are able to create those kinds of loose connections and close connections that you need to survive. And when we look at various immigrant communities, we see that the ones that live in enclaves actually do better economically than the ones that are dispersed throughout the city, because they do not have the ability to connect with others. So while I appreciate Shadi's efforts to make sure that people feel like they have a sense of belonging to the wider society, that it's really good that we have the ability.
I mean, I guess the question is, how do we do both? You know, here I have an anecdote to sort of match this, which is that there is a Vietnamese community in New Orleans East, that highly Catholic and highly connected community. And after Katrina, they lost no one. They lost very, very few, because the priests in that community knew where everybody was, and they tracked them and they supported them and all that stuff. When it came to the recovery, they had markets that the Asian community was running that were serving predominantly that neighborhood. And I was involved in supporting sort of other kinds of food justice issues, community movements. And we tried to see if the Vietnamese market vendors would come into the other areas, or vice versa. Could we create some markets in New Orleans East that would have a more diverse kind of mix? And it was very, very difficult. The enclave wanted to remain the enclave. I'm wondering in Edmonton, Lucinia, how have you guys resolved that? Because, and I want to say it's so good to have you from Edmonton, because we're just about to publish one of our CUI local reports on Edmonton. We spent an intense week in Edmonton late last year, and as part of our CUI local program, and saw so many fabulous things that most of Canada doesn't know about Edmonton. So we're going to tell that story. One of which is how extraordinarily effective the newcomer sort of integration, to use Shadi's word, is in Edmonton, how intentional you are. But how have you mastered that tension in Edmonton, both of integration, but also supporting the kind of cohesion that you can get in an ethnically or culturally organized community? How do you balance that?
Well, I think there was a study done a couple of years ago by one of our urban professors in the University of Alberta, Dr. Agrawal, who actually studied how newcomers and defined it as people who have arrived 10 years or less, have been in Edmonton 10 years or less, how they are dispersed throughout the city. And it's actually interesting to see that they actually live in suburban neighborhoods. And then when we overlay this with, with the clients that people come to the multicultural help workers, which is kind of a sizable number, over 4,000, we mapped them where they are, and they actually resonated with this distribution. And of course, there are some identifiable clusters of ethnic neighborhoods. So one would say Millwoods, which I live, and which is in the southeast area of Edmonton, is definitely South Asians. But of course, we're seeing a lot of Filipinos, right? Central Edmonton would be mostly, the Asian, Chinese, and Vietnamese, because there is Chinatown in there. So lots of Latin Africans would mostly be in the Northeast. Now, of course, I mean, that's where our mapping tells us. So, yes, I agree, Diane. Ethnic enclaves in neighborhoods, because of course, you mentioned Putnam social capital. The first link is called bonding social capital, which is our connection within our family and our familiar communities. And it's very important for for newcomers to integrate, that they feel that kind of bonding before they actually go out and do the bridging capital, which is going outside of their community. So my point then is going back to what Diane had said. Ultimately, where do immigrants live? Of course, in neighborhoods. They are the final destination, and they offer the most astonishing possibilities of how can we, in all our differences, be at home, live together in multicultural and multiracial neighborhoods. And I think because it's in neighborhoods are our village, a safe space where we can be ourselves and feel a sense of community. That's why I hope that city planners will invest more in creating neighborhoods that are inclusive. So just when we, and also collect data when we know I think we all know that many immigrants live in multi-generational household, grandma, our parents, and our kids. But yet, neighborhoods aren't designed to meet these needs. Just to give you one example, in my own neighborhood, and I think this is true. So every neighborhood will always have a playground. But they are just, there's those play amenities. But what about the people who are actually watching the kids? Now, we all assume that their younger parents will be watching their kids. Really, it's about grandmas.
Could be us. Could be the old folks.
Yes, and yet we don't have benches. In my playground, there's two picnic tables, and they're always full.
Mm-hmm.
But what if we have things like that, where grandparents can actually be there, talk to each other, or maybe a nice gazebo with the shade, so they could be there. So our neighborhoods aren't designed to meet the evolving needs of neighborhoods. And then we have little shopping centers in neighborhoods now, but large parking areas, nothing in between, where people can just gather together. So what I wanted to say is, maybe it's about time that we think about designing our neighborhoods so that they are safer, they are diverse, that they meet diverse needs, they're inclusive, and really build that sense of connections that that we need. Because connection builds trust. Of course, it reduces loneliness, but it's also build confidence and a sense of belonging for newcomers who really want to make it in this new homeland.
You know, I just want to flag for people that this isn't, you know, it's not just newcomers that experience
Yeah.
loneliness and solitude. There's old comers, there's seniors, there's all sorts of folks. There's regular people like all of us. We've all had our moments of struggle, and whether or not we've got the kind of architecture, social architecture in built form to allow us to somehow mitigate that somehow, right? Go ahead, Shadi, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Thank you for that. Actually, I just want to highlight it again, that policies take time to change. And sometimes it takes forever. And we don't know that whether it will work by the end or not. So in the field, we can take action. We can make the difference. Actually, in Together project, which I'm a part of, we usually reach out to the beneficiaries. We don't call them clients even. We don't like that word. We call them beneficiaries. We call them partners. We care for them. We look for them. We look for them. Then we look after them. We want to know what they need. What service do they need? This is what I want to do, and this is what I want to the message that I want to deliver. That we can take action and we can let policies take time until they are implemented. Yeah, but we can't just stay.
So can we bridge this kind of, and you've got this fabulous instinct around connection and different ways to do it, and COVID's pushed us all into digital, but I'm sure that instinct existed before. And then we've got this opportunity to actually change the way the built environment could actually enable that. And I'm interested, Patty, do you want to comment on that? You may have another idea you want to throw in, but go for it, whatever you'd like to say.
Thank you, Lucinia. You just raised such amazing points. Thank you for putting that out there. I'm thinking right now, and thanks, Shadi, also for bringing light to this. Yes, policies takes change, and in Canada they take a lot of time. I just want to say that there's we have the low-hanging fruit actions that we can identify and that we can start working on them. And we have seen that neighbors are actually doing this during COVID. How many of us have been seeing like the musicians that are playing in the front yard, or the people that have appropriated the strip, the green strip in between the sidewalk and the street, and they have started gardening. Some people have started using more the rooftops, even when there was an actual use for the rooftop, and then just hanging out there. So there are a lot of things that people are already doing. And as designers or city makers, we have to keep an eye on those things, because it's not from the expert side that we need to be bringing the solutions to loneliness or social isolation. They are already out there. So we need to listen, to hear to the community, to feel what they are needing, so that we can meet people where they are. That's one of the things about having an equity approach to design, meeting people where they are, instead of trying to bring all of this theoretical things that we think that might be right. I mean, they can bring light to these things, but it's not the only thing.
Well, and can we enable them to actually
exactly so that's
their own
the
thing.
Policy piece. So that's the policy piece as well. So if we are seeing that this is happening, we can put the resources in front of them, and then we can make this happen in an easier way. But then the policy side, even if it takes years, we need to be pushing, because what Lucinia was saying is right. I don't want to teach newcomers, and I don't want to be told that I cannot live in an intergenerational housing. If that's my cultural background, then there should be space for that. And as planners, as policymakers, we need to be thinking about the diversity that we want to bring in our city, so that we can allow for that type of development. So there's enabling pieces that can be made at the community level, and there's enabling pieces that can be made at the policy level.
You know, I worry a little bit too that we get snobby about this, and we say, oh, it's got to look like that, and it's got to be like this. I see somebody citing that Asian grandmothers used to go to Gerrard Square, and which is close to where I live, and that is not the most visually appealing place in the world, but it's interesting that communities appropriate it, you know, and they make it their own. And sometimes it's a parking lot. In fact, Lucinia, you were mentioning parking lots. I hope that one of the things out of COVID that we're going to do is seize these spaces that we maybe thought were kind of not very useful, and let's put something dynamic. Let's community people create something fabulous. This is what the Canada Healthy Communities Initiative is trying to do. Perhaps somebody could put that into the chat if you're not aware of that initiative that the federal government has funded and that we're helping administer. It's about community-based placemaking responses. So I'm going to go around to each of you and just ask for a couple of thoughts about tangible priorities that you would suggest we should focus on around addressing this issue of solitude in the city, and particularly as we come back to some kind of semblance of congregate life. So I'm going to go to you first, Lucinia.
Okay, so urban isolation is a complex issue experienced differently by different people, as we have just discussed. But I think it's something that can be untangled and tackled at two levels. One is from building resilience to thrive in the midst of adversity among individuals, but also building resilience in systems and institutions, particularly city governments in this context. So some really tangible things? What I really want is to have a look. We need data, right? Is to have a look at our neighborhoods right now and see where are we missing here? What are the gaps in terms of building connectedness? And I'm not going through a whole set of indicators. I'm sure Patty can give us a whole set of indicators of what to look for, but really just a thoughtful and mindful exploration. How are our neighborhoods looking? And what's missing in terms of building connectedness among for everyone, regardless of identities? That's what I wanted. And from there, then we can start at looking at specific solutions.
What are we not seeing? What are we not seeing, and what don't we know? I just asked one of my colleagues to put the COVID 365 link in, because we exposed this and talk about how we don't have good data. Although we do know that there's been disproportionate incidence of COVID into the Filipino community. You've probably seen that, Lucinia. So, but we had to scrape that data. It was crazy. So good question, good emphasis. What do you look at your own neighborhood, and what don't you know? And when you look eyes to the street, what are you seeing and what aren't you seeing? Okay, Shady, you next.
Yeah, so the main theme of today was loneliness. So to overcome loneliness, we need to change the mindset of people, because it's not related to COVID. Let's change the mindset of people. Let's encourage them to integrate, to get involved more and more. Let's listen to each other's story. Let's encourage others who can't tell their stories. Let's encourage them to tell their stories, know their issues, and work on them. And that can all happen through integration, because it's a very big word. It has lots of meanings, and it needs many activities to be implemented, but it can be done.
Good, a mix. Diane, and then Patty, you'll do cleanup. Yeah, Diane.
Sorry. I think one of the other insights that struck me too, when we look at how to make sure that loneliness doesn't happen within a neighborhood, and yes, they can trap you, is that there's an increasing homogeneity. Our neighborhoods are more and more just the same people living among each other, of the same income bands, living in the same forms of housing. And our zoning laws and very practical things like that do not allow us to have somebody age it through in the neighborhood, because as your neighbor, my neighbor is Greek, and when she moved here, there was all kinds of Greek neighbors around, and she was connected, and now they've all moved away. She's left and feeling lonely, wondering, not able to interact very easily with many of us. But if there had been a space where she could have retired to, where the other neighbors had gone, instead of scattering off to where the children have landed, we would have been able to have saved that. So I guess my plea is that we think about changing the built form so that people can live there at all different life stages.
Aging in place.
Yeah, and at all different income levels. And in that way, we can make a difference.
Again, making this connection between not just public space, but actually living environments. Patty, last word for you.
Thank you. I'm going to be very objective and give things that's straightforward we can be doing in terms of design. Gentle infill in single family home neighborhoods. build flexibility into units so that people can age in place. Include spaces in multi-unit developments that can allow for intimate encounters, 4 to 5 people, then with neighbors, 12 households, and then with a larger community. Promote missing middle, because this allows residents living in 4 or 5 floors to keep an eye and be connected to the public realm. And last but not least, involve people in the co-creation process of multi-unit housing and public spaces, amplifying the voices of vulnerable populations and underrepresented minorities. I just want to leave, I want to amplify the term of integration into meeting people where they are, so that we can actually bring the resources to them, meet them where they need to be met.
I always like to think that CUI City Talks are all about ground up urbanism, building from the ground up, and how much we can learn by actually looking in our neighborhoods, paying attention. That's what we've been trying to do through COVID. Thank you to people like you who are helping us try to understand what we're seeing. So I want to thank Shadi and Lucinia, my colleague Diane, thanks for joining us, and Patty coming in. I'm so sorry about the snow, Lucinia, but it will melt. And just to say that there have been really interesting comments here in the chat, including Laurel Snyder raising the question about the privatization of space. I'd love to do another session on that, Laurel. Can you get in touch with us and let's figure out how we build that session? I yesterday spoke to the Canadian Urban Libraries Council across the country and said, libraries, libraries, libraries. We need to know what the new library is going to look like, and we need these kinds of shared spaces. I don't know whether we're going to call it a library. Maybe it's a parking lot. I want that bench where I can sit down, because I'm old enough to be a grandmother. So thanks everybody for joining us. Tomorrow, if you're a part of the Canadian Healthy Communities Initiative, you're interested in that program, remembering it's not just a federal program, gang. We're building places across this country to do all the things that these panelists have highlighted today. Build better connections, give a sense of belonging, and it's about more than just what the federal government is funding. It's about how we can each collectively contribute to that kind of way of seeing our world and building the communities around us. So there is a mobilization session tomorrow from 2 to 3:30. Someone's put it up in the chat. Thanks very much. Always great to have you on City Talk. So thanks for, and thanks obviously to the Goethe Institute, and particularly to Jutta Brodnul, who's been our partner all along. Watch some of those films. Let's keep thinking about how we strengthen our connections to one another as a way of strengthening our sense of belonging to each other and to the city. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.